He was only 36, but President Ke.n.y.a of Burkina Faso had already become a nightmare for Western diplomats. At a Nairobi summit, a senior official from Kenya publicly mocked his fantasy of new African money, calling it the tantrum of a boy in a general's costume. Laughter echoed in the hall. But just weeks later, the world changed. A failed assassination attempt shocked the continent. Then came the leak, a top-secret CIA memo linking the attack to meetings held inside a Kenyan embassy. What began as ridicule turned into a revelation. This wasn't just politics. It was war over African unity, sovereignty, and self-reliance. If you believe that Africa deserves leaders who stand tall against foreign pressure, if you believe in a future built on unity, dignity, and African self-reliance, if you see hope in the fire behind Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then don't just watch history unfold. Be part of it. Like this video, share it with those who still believe in justice, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, betrayal, and the unstoppable rise of a new Africa. This is more than content. It's a movement. And it needs your voice. At the East Africa Development Forum in Nairobi, President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone. His proposal for a continent-wide monetary reform, bold, unorthodox, and unapologetically anti-colonial, was met with silence, then snide laughter. One Kenyan minister leaned into the microphone and said, "Maybe Ouagadougou should fix its power grid before trying to fix Africa." The room erupted in diplomatic chuckles, the kind that pretended civility but dripped with contempt. The message was clear: Traoré, the youngest leader in the room, wasn't to be taken seriously. His ideas were painted as fantasies. His vision, a threat to those too comfortable in systems built by others. But behind that mockery was something deeper, a fear none dared admit. Because Traoré was not speaking to presidents and ministers, he was speaking to the millions outside those walls. To the vendors, the farmers, the students, the revolutionaries. To the restless generation no longer willing to trade pride for aid. And while officials scoffed at the notion of a new African money, designed to free nations from the grip of the CFA franc and dollar dependency, the youth saw in it a mirror of their own longing, for dignity, for ownership, for liberation from inherited chains. The Nairobi moment was not just a diplomatic slight. It was a calculated attempt to diminish Traoré's growing influence. Rumors began circulating of a backroom plan to politically isolate him, to paint him as a destabilizer. Foreign advisors labeled his ideas populist rhetoric with dangerous implications. International media portrayed him as volatile, even reckless. Back home in Burkina Faso, however, the response was the opposite. Footage of the insult went viral. Traoré's calm demeanor, his refusal to retaliate with anger, his unwavering poise, those things resonated with a population used to being humiliated by outsiders and their own elites. What they didn't expect, what none of them saw coming, was how this single moment of humiliation would spark a ripple effect far beyond the conference room. Rather than silencing him, the mockery became a rallying cry. Within days, murals of Traoré appeared on walls across Bamako, Niamey, and even parts of Dakar, tagged with the words, "Our voice, our future." In universities and street corners, debates erupted, not about whether his ideas were perfect, but whether they were finally the start of something real. The laughter that echoed in Nairobi did not age well. Because beneath the insult lay the tremble of a system that sensed its own decay. Traoré, misunderstood and mocked, had done something extraordinary: he had made the powerful nervous. And in doing so, he had drawn a line between a past defined by obedience and a future that refused to bow. Just 2 weeks after the Nairobi summit, the unexpected happened. President Ibrahim Traoré's motorcade was ambushed on a quiet stretch of highway outside Ouagadougou. The attackers were heavily armed and highly trained, not ragtag insurgents but professionals. Security forces responded swiftly, managing to repel the assault with minimal casualties. Traore survived, unharmed, but shaken. Within hours, the government declared it an act of terror, yet insiders whispered of something more sinister. The patterns didn't match any known rebel group. The timing, so soon after the Nairobi insult, was too precise. And most disturbing of all, none of the attackers were identified. Burkina intelligence began combing through surveillance footage, intercepted signals, and satellite data. What they discovered stunned even the most seasoned analysts. Encrypted messages traced back to an unassuming diplomatic residence in Nairobi, often used for closed-door meetings between Western envoys and Kenyan officials. The chatter was filled with vague phrases: neutralize the threat, prevent further destabilization, and contain the currency wave. The target was never named, but all signs pointed toward Traore. It wasn't just an attack. It was a message cloaked in silence: back down, or face elimination. For Traore, it was a turning point. He had always understood the risks of defying the old order, but now those risks had materialized as bullets. His staff urged caution. Allies advised him to tone down the rhetoric. But the failed assassination didn't weaken him, it radicalized him. Days later, he gave a televised address not with fear, but with fire. He called the attack a coward's attempt to assassinate an idea, and vowed that the new African money would launch within the year. His voice trembled with conviction. Across the continent, millions watched in silence, and then erupted in applause. The streets of Ouagadougou filled with protesters and supporters. Women chanted slogans of resistance. Youths painted his image on walls, fists raised high. For the first time in decades, a leader who had bled with the people now bled for them. Not literally, but symbolically. In cafes from Niamey to Kisangani, people no longer asked if the system could change. They asked when. The assassination had failed in every sense. Not only did it miss its mark, it amplified the very thing it sought to destroy. But behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Western diplomats called for an immediate de-escalation of rhetoric. Kenyan officials issued sterile statements of disapproval. Aid threats loomed. Still, Traore did not flinch. The more they warned, the more he spoke. In one chilling quote, he declared, "If unity is dangerous, then let danger be our path." That line spread like wildfire. The young saw a leader who wouldn't beg for safety. He had been threatened, nearly killed, and yet he remained unbending. What began as an ambush had evolved into a rebirth. The bullet missed, but the truth landed. And its echo could not be silenced. As the continent reeled from the attempted assassination of Ibrahim Traoré, a storm brewed behind closed doors. Western media rushed to shift the narrative, branding the attack as the work of rogue extremists, while subtly questioning whether Traoré's rhetoric had incited violence. Headlines called him divisive, unstable, and even dangerous. A French journalist went as far as labeling him a populist playing with fire. Meanwhile, Kenyan officials publicly condemned the violence but refused to acknowledge the damning leaks surfacing online. The diplomatic machine was in overdrive: distort, discredit, distract. But the internet had already done its damage. One leak changed everything. A whistleblower inside an African intelligence agency released a trove of classified files. Among them was a summary of a meeting held in Nairobi between two CIA officials and Kenya's Minister of Foreign Affairs. The minutes of the conversation were blunt, cold, and unmistakable. The phrase, "contain the spread of Pan-African monetary destabilization," was highlighted. The names weren't redacted. The coordinates matched the same diplomatic building traced during the failed assassination plot. This wasn't just an implication, it was exposure. The world now saw what the whispers had been hinting at. The attack on Traore was not random, and Kenya might have played a critical role. Traore, already hailed by many as a symbol of resistance, now became a martyr in motion. He didn't need to shout. The facts spoke louder than any speech. At a press briefing in Ouagadougou, he calmly read excerpts from the leaked documents, then looked straight into the camera and said, "If African unity is a threat to global order, then maybe the world needs a new order." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just a political moment, it was a generational spark. In Kenya, however, the situation escalated. Protests erupted in Nairobi and Mombasa. Many young Kenyans, disillusioned with their government's perceived loyalty to the West, marched in solidarity with Burkina Faso. Placards read, "Not in our name," and "Africa for Africans." For the first time, Traore's message had breached national borders not as a doctrine but as a conviction shared by the people. It was no longer just about him, it was about them, all of them, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. What began as an effort to silence a revolutionary had backfired spectacularly. The smear campaign collapsed under the weight of truth. Leaked files, suppressed voices, hidden agendas, they all became weapons in the hands of a digitally awakened generation. Traore didn't have to defend himself, the people did it for him. His silence turned into strength. His restraint became revolution. And in that fire, a new Africa began to forge itself, not in boardrooms, but in streets, screens, and stories. The more they tried to bury him, the louder his message roared. In the days following the leak, international pressure mounted like never before. Western embassies in Ouagadougou issued synchronized statements urging de-escalation of rhetoric and cooperation with democratic allies. Behind the polished language was a barely veiled threat: fall in line or face economic retaliation. Meanwhile, anonymous legal briefs were reportedly delivered to Burkina Faso's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, warning that the president's accusations could violate diplomatic protocols and trigger sanctions. It was a classic move. An attempt to corner Ibrahim Traoré through the threat of international legal action. The message was brutal in its simplicity: silence yourself, or we will isolate you. But Traoré didn't blink. Instead of retreating, he called a press conference and invited not only African journalists but independent media from Latin America and Asia. Standing in front of a simple wooden podium, surrounded by his people, he said, "I have been threatened with isolation. I have been mocked and nearly killed. But you cannot isolate a soul connected to its roots." The moment was electric. Without raising his voice, Traoré transformed a legal threat into a global declaration of defiance. What was intended to intimidate him only made him more powerful in the eyes of a disillusioned continent. At the heart of his speech was a challenge, that African unity and self-reliance were not crimes, and that any legal system attempting to brand them as such was part of the problem. He asked a simple but damning question: when did freedom become illegal? The phrase spread like wildfire. It was printed on posters in Bamako, painted on murals in Accra, and even echoed during student protests in South Africa. Legal scholars across the continent began analyzing the leaked documents and drafting open letters defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty. The West had hoped to use the law to break him. Instead, Traoré put the law itself on trial. And in Kenya, the backlash grew even more visible. University lecturers were suspended for defending Traoré. A journalist was detained after publishing an exposé about Nairobi's involvement in the diplomatic plot. But for every silenced voice, 10 more rose up. Kenyan youth groups began openly defying government statements, demanding full transparency. The more the state tried to cover its tracks, the more visible the cracks became. Traoré's message wasn't just traveling, it was igniting. The legal threats, the diplomatic rebukes, the media distortions, they had all been designed to control the narrative. But what those in power failed to realize was that the narrative no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the people, to a generation that had watched their future bargained away for decades. Ibrahim Traoré had been misunderstood, mocked, and nearly erased. But in trying to destroy his credibility, his enemies had only proven why his message mattered. The legal noose they tightened had become the symbol of their fear, and his freedom. Weeks after the assassination attempt and the diplomatic threats, something extraordinary began to unfold. In the heart of Ouagadougou, a massive gathering was organized, not by the government, but by the people. Farmers, teachers, artists, war veterans, and students all marched side by side toward the city center, waving flags not just of Burkina Faso, but of Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even the Pan-African tricolor. The message was unmistakable: this was not just about Ibrahim Traoré. This was about reclaiming an African identity that had for too long been dictated by others. The ridicule he faced, the bullets fired at him, and the legal threats hurled in silence had sparked something larger than any one man. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré watched the sea of people from a balcony. He did not wave. He did not speak. He simply stood, stoic, silent, but visibly moved. The image was broadcast live, and across the continent, millions watched in awe. For once, a leader didn't demand loyalty. He earned it. His restraint, his clarity, and his refusal to play by colonial rules had carved out a new kind of authority, one not enforced by weapons or alliances, but by trust. In an era where leadership often feels hollow, Ibrahim Traoré had become a symbol of something long buried: belief. Meanwhile, in West African capitals, something shifted. Politicians who once distanced themselves from Traoré's ideology now began to reference his speeches. News outlets that had previously mocked the new African money started hosting panels debating its merits. Think tanks from Dakar to Addis Ababa scrambled to release reports analyzing Burkina Faso's economic model. The shift wasn't overnight, but it was unmistakable. Traoré had moved from the margins to the center, not by force, but by consequence. Every attack on his credibility had built his legitimacy. Every insult had confirmed the urgency of his mission. Even the African Union, once hesitant to embrace his boldness, invited him to deliver a special address. On that day, he wore his signature red beret and military fatigues, not to intimidate, but to remind the world who he was: a soldier of the people. His speech was not fiery. It was composed, deliberate, and filled with the wisdom of a man who had faced death not once, but through countless betrayals. He spoke of a future where no African nation would ever again need permission to dream. And when he concluded, the applause did not stop for nearly 2 minutes. Ibrahim Traoré had been called dangerous, reckless, and naive. But in the end, he had done something far more radical than his critics imagined: he had made millions believe again. Not in him, but in themselves. The mocking voices from Nairobi were now quiet. The legal threats had faded. What remained was a continent beginning to wake up. Not because a hero had arrived, but because a mirror had been held up, and Africa, for the first time in a long time, liked what it saw. 4-0. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not simply a political drama, it is a profound lesson in power, courage, and the rebirth of a continent's self-belief. What began as a campaign of humiliation, legal threats, and attempted violence against one man became a mirror for millions of Africans, reflecting their deepest frustrations and their highest hopes. Traoré's journey teaches us that true leadership is not measured by international approval or diplomatic decorum, but by the ability to inspire dignity in the forgotten, strength in the oppressed, and courage in the silenced. At the heart of this lesson lies the power of misunderstanding, and how it can backfire. When Traoré was mocked at the Nairobi summit, those who laughed did so under the illusion that ridicule could contain vision. They misunderstood him as a fringe figure, an idealist playing soldier, a man whose dreams were too big for the crumbling walls of his country. But in doing so, they revealed their own fear. Because Traore wasn't just proposing a new currency or criticizing neo-colonial influence, he was daring to rewrite the story of African dependency. And stories, once rewritten, are impossible to unhear. The assassination attempt showed the extent to which those invested in the old order would go to silence the new. It taught us that ideas, once dangerous enough, are often met not with debate but with bullets. Yet Traore's survival flipped the narrative. He emerged not as a victim, but as proof that even the most powerful networks cannot kill a message whose time has come. His calm resilience became a lesson in emotional strength. He never shouted. He never begged. And in that silence, he carried a continent's voice louder than any speech ever could. The leak of classified documents was more than a political bombshell, it was a moral reckoning. When the truth surfaced, when CIA meetings and foreign diplomacy were exposed as weapons of suppression, the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality, that democracy and sovereignty in Africa are too often supported only when they serve external interests. The lesson here is one of awareness. Africa must not only build its institutions, it must guard them. Because in a world where influence is currency, ignorance is vulnerability. Traore's defiance reminded Africa that truth is power, and power must be claimed, not requested. The legal threats disguised as diplomatic warnings were another test, and another lesson. When institutions meant to uphold justice are used to stifle resistance, it becomes clear that legality does not always equal legitimacy. Traore's refusal to be intimidated by international lawfare taught Africans to question the systems they've been told to obey. His simple question, when did freedom become illegal, became a continent-wide challenge. It forced both leaders and citizens to examine whether their laws serve justice or submission. The lesson is sobering, that legality can be weaponized, and that freedom often begins where obedience ends. But perhaps the greatest lesson came not from Traore himself, but from the people. It was their reaction, spontaneous, passionate, fearless, that turned his message into a movement. In a world of digital distractions and political apathy, the sight of youth organizing, artists painting, and elders marching was a powerful reminder that hope still lives where truth is spoken. The people taught us that authenticity matters more than perfection. Traore was not a flawless leader. But he was real, and in that reality, a nation, and then a continent, saw itself reflected. Another vital lesson was the transformation of trauma into momentum. Where past leaders might have retreated after an assassination attempt or bowed under pressure, Traore advanced. He did not let pain paralyze him. Instead, he channeled it into purpose. He showed that revolution does not always roar, sometimes, it marches quietly through the streets, painted on the walls, whispered in the classrooms, and emotional endurance is the foundation of true political strength. In the end, Traore's story teaches us that Africa is not waiting for saviors, it is discovering its voice. Leaders like him do not manufacture change, they unlock what is already buried beneath generations of silence. His stance on new African money, his commitment to unity, and his rejection of foreign control are not just policies, they are signals. Signals that the age of quiet compliance is ending. The lesson is clear, Africa must stop asking for permission to be free. And for the rest of the world, there is a lesson too. That control built on fear will always fall to conviction built on truth. That mocking the young, the bold, and the radical only fuels their determination. That movements cannot be killed if they are rooted in the hearts of the people. The story of Ibrahim Traoré reminds us that empires don't collapse in explosions, they crumble when one man dares to stand alone, and thousands choose to stand with him. The lesson is not just for Africa. It is for anyone who has ever been underestimated, silenced, or threatened for dreaming too big. The future does not belong to the cautious. It belongs to those brave enough to imagine it differently, and stubborn enough to keep walking when the world tells them to stop. The public reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's story has been nothing short of electric, with a wave of admiration and support flooding in from all corners of Africa. Many viewers are calling his resilience in the face of international ridicule and assassination attempts nothing short of inspiring. "He's not just a leader, he's a symbol of Africa's rebirth," one comment read. Supporters praise his refusal to be intimidated by foreign powers, saying that his strength lies in his conviction to put Africa's future first. To them, Traoré represents a break from the past, a break from the endless cycle of reliance on Western powers. For many, the moment that stood out the most was when Traoré addressed the media after surviving the attack. His words, "If unity is dangerous, then let danger be our path," became a rallying cry for those who have long felt oppressed and underestimated. "Finally, a leader who speaks the truth," one commenter exclaimed. "Africa has waited too long for a leader who won't bow to foreign demands. We need more people like him who are willing to fight for us." This sentiment echoed across social media platforms, with thousands sharing his message of self-reliance and sovereignty. Others pointed to the dramatic moment when the CIA documents were leaked, showing the lengths to which some foreign powers were willing to go to suppress the rise of an African leader who dared to challenge the status quo. Viewers were quick to condemn the hypocrisy of Western nations, especially those who have long claimed to champion democracy and human rights. "This is the real face of imperialism," one viewer commented, "when countries that preach about freedom try to kill the voice of the people when it dares to speak up." However, not all the reactions were positive. Some critics questioned Traoré's methods and whether his aggressive stance could lead to further instability in the region. "Yes, he's inspiring, but is he pushing Africa into a conflict we're not ready for?" asked one viewer in a YouTube comment. "We need unity, but not at the cost of more violence. Diplomacy should come before revolution." These critics are concerned that his bold actions could risk alienating potential allies or exacerbate tensions with neighboring countries. Still, the overwhelming majority of responses reflect a desire for change, one that does not rely on the same tired systems that have failed Africa for so long. The debate among the audience is not just about Traoré as a leader, but what his rise represents for Africa as a whole. People are finally starting to believe that true sovereignty is possible, and that African nations can chart their own course without waiting for approval from the West. "He is teaching us to stand tall and demand respect," one commenter wrote. "Africa must take control of its destiny, and Traoré is showing us the way." In the end, the comments and reactions show a continent on the brink of transformation. Ibrahim Traoré may have started as a figure of controversy, but now he is a symbol of hope. Whether they agree or not with his methods, one thing is clear: people are listening. And more importantly, they are beginning to believe that Africa's future belongs to Africans.